It wouldn't have happened if you would have been at home. It wouldn't have happened if somehow you negotiated that deal and you're like, let me smoke weed, and they were like, okay, let's try that. That it wouldn't have happened.
The obsession that we talk about, when we talk about how folks who have addiction issues, it's a rewiring of the brain that is different than the rest of the population. I talked to you about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It was the drugs that I was obsessed with. And once I experienced that, it was this genuine feeling of I'm not going to be able to live without this.
People with addictions, we're not able to connect the dots between the consequences and the usage. We have what's called euphoric recall. And what we are doing is when the memory is getting written in our brain, we are remembering it in real time as though that other part didn't happen. Welcome to the Why Intervention Podcast. I am your host, Christopher Doyle, today joined by Leah Lemberg. Leah is a business coach and speaker who helps high-powered business owners achieve more freedom, profitability, and balance through strategic growth and mindset shifts. She's the creator of the Freedom Framework and Pipeline Mastery, 2 courses designed to help entrepreneurs scale their businesses and create sustainable growth. Leah's one-on-one work is grounded in personal accountability, and she draws from her own journey of overcoming addiction and adversity to inspire others. That's why she's here with us today. It's going to be great. As a speaker, Leah delivers actionable insights on business, strategy, leadership, and personal transformation. Really excited to introduce everyone to Leah. Hi, Leah.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. This is really exciting.
Yeah. So, our podcast is focused on helping family members navigate a loved one's addiction. Oftentimes, I just love to hear the stories of people who have struggled in addiction, overcome addiction. And of course, I just love, even if for nothing else, you read the bio and you go, wow, look how much she's accomplished, how far she's come, how well she's doing, and that recovery is possible. And so, I always like getting these kinds of stories out there. So welcome. Thank you so much. Is there anything from the bio that, we didn't cover tonight, or something that you feel, you'd like to mention?
No, it's funny. Whenever I hear that read, and, I've had various iterations over the years as my career has changed and whatnot, it trips me out because for all intents and purposes, I should not be here, and that should not be my now bio, right? So every time I hear it, it's an honor to have it read. I do appreciate you reading that, because it's a testament to being sober for the amount of time that I have been. And
you're sober for 16 years now?
16 years as of January 9th this year.
Wow. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So 16, and for anybody watching the video, so then you got sober when you were 12, 13, 14 years old?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I got sober when I was 18. I was plucked out of high school. I'm sure we'll get into the weeds with it, but I was plucked out of high school and sent down to a treatment center that managed to stick for me. So I'm a one and doneer, which is, I know, shocking, especially given the age that I did get sober. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, we'll definitely get into the weeds of that. But why don't we jump back to just when you first started using substances, and maybe what was going on for you, if you can go back that far, just even the emotional state, and, what was your life like prior to picking up any substances?
For sure. We were the last house on a dirt dead-end road in rural North Carolina. There's not much going on there then, and there's not much going on there now. It still holds a place in my heart. And yet, both of my parents were pharmacists, if that's going to raise any red flags for you there. And my dad specifically had a small town pharmacy in a town even smaller than the one that we were living in. And we grew up under the mentality that you don't have sick days, you tough it out, and you treat yourself and move on. That was the direction he was given when he first became a pharmacist in the late 70s, right? You don't have sick days, you treat yourself and move on. So even when I was very young, there were warning signs, pretty blatant warning signs. I would violently fake a cough so that I could get cough medicine. I was drug seeking from a very young age. Yeah, it was weird stuff. However, generally speaking, growing up in the middle of nowhere was fun. I had a very active imagination, but I did grow up in an alcoholic home. My dad got sober 4 years before I did. There was not a ton of the horrible stuff that you might hear in terms of violence or things along those lines. However, there wasn't a ton of emotional stability. There was no emotional stability. And there's a lot of turmoil and anger and frustration amongst them, and a lot of us, me and my brother, left to ourselves and our own devices, make believe, video games, and eventually drugs.
Yeah. And even, I mean, the cough medicine, how old were you when you started pulling that scam?
My God, I can remember that genuinely. I remember being in the back of my dad's Cutlass Sierra on the way home from his pharmacy and him turning around and saying, enough, stop. Like, it's fake, quit. And that was preschool. That was preschool. I was young.
Okay.
We also, being out in the middle of nowhere, we didn't have cable or satellite. We had, the 5 basic channels, but we did have a love for rock music and record player and the box set, the VHS box set of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And I would watch those on repeat and listen to the music on repeat. My brother was big into the 90s grunge scene. He's 6 years older than me. Okay. And all of that was just wildly fascinating to me. All the things that kind of went along with that lifestyle, specifically the drugs, just seemed really interesting to me from a very young age as well.
Yeah. And was your brother, did he use any substances also, or?
Interestingly enough, my brother was the troublemaker. He was the one that would get suspended from school, wreck cars, all of that. But he's straight. He had his own fun, and he got into plenty of trouble when he was younger, but then he buttoned up and straightened up and was fine. I, on the other hand, kind of played it like, don't look over here, everything's fine over here, but was the one that was really causing the ruckus.
That's great. Yeah, I love pointing that stuff out for family members, because even when you said, like, so the signs were there. And so even if you were to kind of compare your brother's experience to your own, here you are in the same house, what is different about you? What warning signs were there? Gosh. If you're from the outside looking in and you say, like, so here's this girl, she's 6 years younger than this brother, and he's getting into trouble, but what were some of the subtle signs that you may have been showing, but if you don't know what you're looking at, you don't know what you're looking at?
That's such an interesting question, and that's not something that I feel like is talked about much, so I'm glad you're bringing this up. It's interesting because I think everyone did look at me and thought, well, she's fine. Mm-hmm. She's good. I was a liar at a very young age. Things would go wrong with, like, a pet getting out or whatever, right? We had gerbils. I can remember the gerbils getting out, and I'd lie about it. And not only would I lie about it, it was like these big, elaborate, like, I'd blame it on a doll, right? Mm-hmm. Like an inanimate object caused this to happen kind of deal. I was spiteful and vengeful. My brother, we had a Jack and Jill bedroom upstairs. It was just our bedroom and the bathroom up there. And when he would tick me off, when he'd make me angry, I'd sneak into his room and he had this basket of pennies and coins, and I'd steal a penny from him every time he pissed me off. And I'd hide them in my window ledge. And again, we left that house. We moved out of that house when I was in the 4th grade. This is young.
Wow, okay.
Little things like that. There was a desperate need for the people around me to be okay. There was a constant kind of arranging of the stage. If everyone around me, if I could just tiptoe around and make sure that everyone else was okay and that no one was upset with me specifically, then everything would be okay. And that energy, that finagling, is what I feel like I was seeking relief from. And
then how old were you the first time that you got drunk or high?
The first time that I specifically remember, like, this was intentional and I actually got some good out of it, so to speak, was the 5th grade. I found my dad's pot and stole his weed, rolling papers, a pack of cigarettes for my brother, stuck it all in a Happy Hanukkah tin. We're Jewish, and it was around that time of the year, it was Hanukkah time, and ran over to a friend's house and was like, guess what I've got? This is going to be great. And I remember it was great for me. And I remember the whole time being like, isn't this incredible? Isn't this amazing? And she was like, I guess I'm not really getting what you're getting off of this. But yeah, 5th grade.
Yeah. So right from the very start, a very different reaction, even from the person next to you.
Yeah.
And you knew it.
Yeah.
You could see it. You could see that it wasn't doing for them what it was doing for you. Yeah. And so after that, was it something that you just, like, dove right into, or because of just the age and, like, how often you could get something, it wasn't something that really took hold at the time?
No, after that, it was as much as I could, as frequently as I could, and it developed pretty quickly. I guess I guess that's not shocking considering that I was plucked out of society at 18. It developed pretty quickly. There was another kid in the neighborhood who was known to be bad news, and he and I linked up, and I was quickly introduced to opiates through him, which again was another one of those wild, mind-blowing moments, 7th grade. And from there, it was genuinely a constant focus of what can I do to find and get. The hitch in all of that was, aside from a couple run-ins with the law, which shockingly I have nothing on a permanent record or was ever charged with anything for some of the shenanigans that I was pulling in the 7th grade. And then again, in the 8th grade, my dad got sober. And that was a weird moment of, well, if he has a problem, I probably will end up having a problem. But I already felt like I was too far gone to really put a stop to it at that point in terms of the use of opiates and whatnot that were going on. Yeah.
So, but what do you mean by that? You think, so you're 14 years old.
Yeah.
And you're thinking, I'm already too far gone.
The obsession that we talk about, when we talk about how folks who have addiction issues, it's a rewiring of the brain that is different than the rest of the population. I talked to you about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame VHS set and being obsessed with that and that lifestyle from a young age. It was the drugs that I was obsessed with. And once I experienced that, it was this genuine feeling of I'm not going to be able to live without this. So when my dad went to rehab, this is a sign of the times. This is a true millennial confession here. Live journal was a thing at the time. This was like an online diary, right? And I've hunted down access to this live journal. I will not share the username because there's some embarrassing stuff in there. But there's journal entries from around that time of my dad getting sober and me reflecting on, I keep trying to stop, and every time I try to stop, someone else, I just can't. The want is too much, the need is too high, and I just am gonna have to figure out how to make this integrate into an okay, successful life. And that, I think, was key too, because my dad was a successful pharmacist by anyone's account. He had no problem holding down a job. I had a horse. We had a good life, right? And it wasn't until everything hit the fan with him that suddenly all the truth came out. I was shocked when he went to rehab. I couldn't believe it. He did not seem like the one in the family who had the problem. And so I felt like, well, I had a perfect example of you can have your cake and eat it too. And just ignored the fact that it turned into a whole big cluster at the end of it. Right.
Which is always an interesting leap of logic, how we can just drop off the ends of all of these stories, I remember getting arrested, but I had this story that I told for years in sobriety about just this great night that I had, and all of this. I hooked up with this girl, and it was great. I grabbed the microphone at a party. The whole place was cheering. It was like this wonderful time. I blacked out. I landed. I was in like a pool table. I came to on top of a pool table in someone's basement. And when I come out from, it's like, this is one of the most incredible things. And for years and years, in recovery, I would tell that story for a laugh, and it was like, I was arrested 2 hours after that. I just left that part off.
Right.
And so, people with addictions, we're not able to connect the dots between the consequences and the usage. We have what's called euphoric recall. And what we are doing is when the memory is getting written in our brain, we are remembering it in real time as though that other part didn't happen.
That's right.
Years later, when we go back to it, all we see is the good thing. It's not like we're just like cherry picking.
Right.
It's like an actual memory that we're going back to. It reads the way that we wrote it.
100%. And I think that feeds into that obsession of it's going to be different this time. Right? Is that every time, to your point, all those memories that I have, if all I have are the positive moments, then surely I can rewrite the ending this time to also be positive. Right?
Right.
And yet it never happens that way.
Yeah. So, at feeling like you're too far gone at 14, and then you still have 4 more years to go.
Yeah. And it didn't get any better, let me tell you. It only got worse from there. So There were brief periods where I would pull my stuff together a little bit. I mentioned I had a horse. That happened in the ninth grade, and that was a big deal. That was a big deal. The only other thing that rivaled drug use for me was horses. I wanted one forever and ever. I busted my butt out at a farm daily to earn the right to have lessons in the whole 9 yards. And my dad, in his pink cloud of sobriety, literally in the first 8 months of his sobriety, came with me to one of these big horse shows that I would do in a different state. And he called me and he was like, "We're getting you a horse." And I was like, "There's no way. And Mom's going to divorce you. And this is ridiculous." And so there were a few brief periods where I would be able to go all in on something else and it would calm down my drug use, but it wouldn't stop it. Things got even more ramped up once I got a license. I had to get a job. The two places that I applied for work were at my mother's pharmacy and at a veterinarian technician for a veterinarian technician position. I intended to be a veterinarian, so figure that out with the bio that I gave you. It does not match up. And became a registered vet tech at this small town veterinary clinic. That gave me access to a whole new realm of use and options and exploration, and things went very quickly downhill. That was 10th grade. At that point, this is where I asked you how gory could I get, right? I quickly started stealing needles from the clinic and experimenting with opiates and intravenous drug use through that method. And then that's expensive. And so then I quickly switched to stealing the leftovers that were in the syringes in the sharps containers and matching things up and trying to figure out what was what and reading the drug manuals. And it's a small clinic. I was in charge of the inventory, and then would quickly just steal what I wanted to from the controlled drug cabinet. That's extremely risky. And around that time, heroin blew up in our area, just completely. And the few friends that I had that knew what I was doing were immediately turned me on to that. And that lasted a year and a half. And then Leah gets plucked out of where she is in such treatment. So that's the condensed version there.
Yeah. So along that way there, when you're working there and you start experimenting in that way, was there ever any consequence that became publicly known? Was there anything that did anything point to what Leah was doing?
It's small things. Again, my whole MO was, as long as I look good, what can you tell me? So I maintained above a 4.0 GPA. Now, this isn't a small town. I don't think that this was some incredible feat, right? This wasn't an academically rigorous area. I maintained above a 4.0 GPA. I continued to train and show horses, intentionally kept a job that was impressive enough that people went, "Damn, she's doing pretty good," right? I was laughing with my husband the other day about some club that I was in high school, and he was like, "Why were you in that?" And I was like, "For appearances, obviously," right? But I did not often total a car, and somehow that wasn't my fault, and I got out of it. I was stealing money from everyone, including my family. That started to come up. That's eventually what the downfall was. Just all kinds of weird things. I was getting, issues with teachers. I looked awful. I was ghostly pale and had bruises everywhere, and just would say that, at the vet's office, I would say, well, I was fighting with this horse that I was training. And at the barn where it's hot, it's North Carolina, where my arms would be exposed, I would say, well, there was this dog that I was wrangling at the vet's office, and would just constantly kind of play it off one another. But I would like to say that the addict in me would like to say that I was pretty sneaky, but then I got caught at 18. So was I really all that sneaky?
Yeah. Well, and how old were you when you totaled the car?
17.
Okay.
Yep.
What was the story?
It was drizzling. Someone pulled in front of me. I T-boned them, but it wasn't my fault. And somehow that flew. I'll tell you too, and this is just something to be aware of, that it's a lot easier when you're a young white woman to get away with a whole bunch of crap without people looking at you and going, "There's something wrong."
I mean, when you're young and when you're able to keep it all together despite all of the things that you were doing, that is the issue. It's even, extend it to your father and his sobriety, like you mentioned. It's like he was keeping it together all the way up until he wasn't, right?
Yep.
And even then, when he got help, you said it was like it was a surprise to you.
There is one thing, I can't believe I forgot this, because this has always been something that I found really interesting about our family dynamic as well. So I should say, when my dad got sober, my mom was not thrilled. And I won't speak for her for all the reasons why. I'm sure that living with someone in active addiction for nearly 30 years is hell in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
The weird dynamic that would show, so I would come back from the vet's office, I wore scrubs, right? And I'd do my laundry. And I remember one day my mom, after a different disagreement, said, I found needles in the dryer. What's that about?
Mm.
And I was like, I'm a vet tech. They're in my scrubs, right? But she had also already found other weird drugs in my bedroom, like vials of vet meds and whatnot. And she didn't say anything. She didn't say anything to my dad. She didn't really say anything to me. Everyone just kind of, if I ignore it, it'll go away. And that's something that we don't have the relationship to talk about that, but I'm very curious as to why that was the reaction. That it was my dad who finally said, something is wrong and we need to pluck her out of this, when it was my mom who had found the needles and the vials, etc.
Yeah. I mean, you and we could do a whole other episode talking about that kind of dynamic and, why that's the response. But I can assure you that your mom responding that way is not atypical,
Right.
I mean, and probably the general blanket statement would just be that, like, well, what do you do? Most people don't know what to do in that situation anyway, right? So you're confronted with something that is almost too big to accept. You're just, gripped by fear. And what do I do? I have no idea what to do.
Yeah.
And so I do nothing. So we're talking about like trauma response. It's freeze.
Absolutely.
So she didn't run because that's another response. You could run, you could fight. And so freeze is one of the things that people do.
Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine, right? Having found that in your 18-year-old daughter's room. Can't imagine.
And, I'm sure that her conversations with her husband led to the eventual plucking.
I'm sure that I would imagine. We'll put it that way.
Okay. So aside from the car wreck then, and before we get to like the instances or like whatever it was that happened, because obviously that's always like a big climactic moment in telling our stories, right? But was there from 14 to 18 for you, and has, craziest things then got, how often were you saying to yourself, I don't want to do this anymore, I got to stop, I'm trying not to do this anymore, I'm cutting back, and telling the people around you maybe like, I'm done, like, don't call me anymore, deleting numbers, all that. Was any of that a part of your deal?
Oh, yeah. For sure. Frequently, and it never stuck very long. I mean, longer than a couple months max in the earlier days of it. And ironically, that is a specific piece of the final day as well, was the swearing off that didn't stick. Yeah, it felt like if I could just pull it back to certain substances, then it would be okay, even, right? If I could just stick to the chill things and not the ridiculously hard stuff, or I could just stop shooting drugs, that alone would be great, right? But it never stuck.
So what were the drugs that you were willing to settle for?
Oh, I wrote a letter in rehab saying, if you just let me come home and smoke weed, this would be great, right? That was my first and my favorite that was an everyday, no matter what period from the jump, pretty much. I guess that was the one that I was really trying to settle on. If I could just get everyone to be okay with that, it'd be okay. But it never stayed that way, right? Every time I would pull it back to just that, it wasn't just that. It was this and a little bit of that.
Yeah. And so that's the kind of delusion that we will oftentimes, and when I say we, I just mean people with addictions, right? Will chase that all the way up until it kills us.
100%.
And because it seems so reasonable. It seems like I should be able to just do a little bit of this, and I never got crazy on this. And if I could go back in time to when I was, for you, it was very young, right? But if I go back to that 12-year-old and where I'm smoking weed and I just do it that way, this should work.
Exactly. And that feels, especially nowadays too, but even at the time, that feels so innocent, acceptable, fair, normal, like all these words that I would throw around of like, but this is fine. But it wasn't, because it couldn't just stay that way.
Yeah. Okay. So then you said that on this, like in the run up to getting plucked, there's a moment where you made a promise or you decided with yourself that you didn't want to do it anymore. And then what happened?
So at this point, literally goodness, there was so much stealing going on at this point. Every day trying to find money to support what I was doing, because at this point, this was an everyday, multiple times a day, had to be maintained habit, or I was going to be sick, right? So specifically stealing from my family, from my parents. And the day that everything fell apart was January 7th, 2009. And I was in school, and my dad called and said, there's a lot of money missing, and I need to know what's going on. And I lied, and at the time, my 90-something-year-old grandmother lived with us, and I blamed it on her. I said, maybe you should check with Nana.
What kind of money are we talking about?
At this point, I was stealing at least $100 a day, and then I was, putting my paycheck towards what I was doing, and I was stealing from the house about $100 a day, and then from from teachers, from all just lots. But from the house specifically, I knew where my dad would keep cash, and I was stealing $100 a day for quite a while. So several thousands of dollars at this point had disappeared. So I tried blaming it on my Nana, which is wild. And then when he said, well, that's not it, try again, I tried to blame it on the housekeeper. And he said, that's not it. That's not it either. And he said something about, like, I think it's your dirty, rotten friends, and they're not allowed at the house anymore. And I didn't have any friends. I had one friend. I had one friend that was still hanging around me at this point, who I had dragged into all of this as well. And I was like, yep, it's probably her. Fine. She's not allowed at the house anymore. Like, anyone other than me go into the bus. So that afternoon, so again, we're in a tiny town, okay? My hometown is 8,000 people. And I've been with these kids since kindergarten. We've gone through the classes together. And I'm sitting in an AP English class in the last period of the day with the same friend that I just told, I can't let you into the house anymore. And I said, but I need to borrow $15 for the last time. And this will be the last time. It has to be. Like, this is it. This has to be the last time. And she lent me $15. And then one of the teachers who I had been with for years and years, who cared about me deeply, who I had been stealing directly from her purse for months, leaned over and handed me a note and said, it's going to be okay. And the note said, your dad's in the office and needs to talk to you. And so I went up to the office real casually and said, what's up? Trying to play it cool. And he said, go get your shit. We're going. And I was like, oh boy. Okay. And I walked back into the room, and everyone kind of looked up at me because it's the end of the day, and I just got this weird note. And I looked at my friend and I said, in slightly different words, I said, I'm screwed. And I walked out, and that was it. I never went back. And so from there, he put me in the car and said, I think you've got a drug problem, and we're going to go get seen about. And I didn't know what to do at this point. I knew I had a drug problem. It was obvious. I was screwed up. I had overdosed several times. I had people overdosing in my car. I had totaled a car. I was, stealing controlled substances from a veterinary office that trusted me to handle the inventory. It was screwed up, and I could not figure out what to do at this point. Senior in high school, supposed to do, go off and go to UNC and have a life. I can't leave my hometown because I can't be far away from my dealer. My dealer, who, by the way, keeps recommending I can sell you Suboxone if you'd like Suboxone instead. Right? At this point, it's just screwed up. So, yeah.
And did you ever use Suboxone? Just curious.
I did a couple times. Again, he would call, and I'd call him, and I'd be like, I'm on the way. And he'd say, well, I've got this. Why don't you try this? I did a couple times, and then I'd say, that sucks. That's not what I want. give me the goods or don't, I won't mess with you anymore and I'll go to someone else.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. So when your father gets you in the car, what's happening for you? What's going on in your head? You're on the way to who knows where. And is it just like you are conceding? Are you
Basically.
scrambling? Are you trying anything?
I feel like it was pretty much a concession at that point. Truly, we went to my like the doctor again, small town, the doctor that saw me when I was a baby. This guy that I've seen for my entire life up until this point, and now I'm having to sit across from him and my father and explain all the things that are. Here's everything. Here's what I'm doing, because at this point, we have that joke of like, and I don't mean to be crass, you can't bullshit a bullshitter. And at this point, I'm sitting across from my dad, who I knew was very sober and was very into 12-step and who really threw himself all the way into it and knew that there was a different way and knew what I was going through and that I could, like, what was I going to say? The jig was up. It was up big time. Mom knew I had needles. Mom knew I had vet med vials. Dad knew I was stealing thousands of dollars. What was I going to say?
So, just as far as like instructive kind of feedback for family members who are listening, right? It's like you can see from your story, there's years of it being out of control, but you're keeping up appearances. From the outside looking in, it wouldn't be something that you're able to really spot, right? I mean, AP English is where you get pulled out of on your last day. Oh my God. AP English. That is, you know what I mean? Like the picture that people have in their mind of someone who is struggling with addiction, it's not a kid coming out of AP English, right? Who has a horse that she's taking care of and has this job and, all of that you mentioned, right? So how can you possibly, and I think that the leg up in this is that, and I have a similar story. My background is also my mother and father were both sober and my mom was sober. And because of that, and so really take this to heart, family members, that my mom had a lot of 12-step recovery under her belt also. And so I got sober when I was 17 because my mom got me to my first recovery program, right? Like, so she took me to the first one. But in both of our cases, it wasn't like you were going to walk your ass from AP English down to the local, 12-step meeting on your own that day, right? And so you got plucked. And that's the point. It's not like there wasn't some form of intrinsic motivation for both of us at various different times over our substance use history in our teens. But we never would have gotten help if, in your case, it wasn't for your dad. And in my case, it wasn't for my mom.
100%. 100%. And I will say, it took another 6 months of kicking and screaming in a long-term treatment center. I was not interested. I was not like, oh, okay, this is the way, this is what I'll do. It took some time, but thank God I was given that opportunity to get, again, plucked and stuck somewhere to just sit and simmer and figure things out for a while.
Yeah. And because I imagine that when you got there, so like, look, this is what's going to be really impressive about this next question, right? Now we have the context of your whole story. And now you're in this place and you're in there for 6 months kicking and screaming. So what were you kicking and screaming about? What were you fighting about? What were you telling them? What lies were you believing about whatever it was that you were doing and why you didn't need to be there and why this is stupid? What was it all about?
Well, because Christopher, I had a good looking life on the outside, right? Like I had an image of I can continue. Maybe not heroin, or maybe I could still do heroin and not use it IV, but I could still do stuff and have the white picket fence if I wanted to. I was on that path, right? So I complained about that a lot, a whole lot. I complained about that. I complained about I'd never had a legal drink in my life, and how are we going to take that away from me? I wasn't even interested in alcohol, but now I'm complaining about it, right? Absolutely did I write a letter to my family saying, here's the deal, here's the bargain, come get me, and I'll just smoke weed, and you can drug test me, and it'll be great, it'll be fine. To which my dad wrote back in a word pad. I could tell by the font, not even like a Word document, but like word pad. You can do whatever you want, wherever you want, but you're not coming back here and using drugs. So good luck. Right. But yeah, I pushed back on 12-step. My God, did I push back on 12-step? I pushed back on pretty much anything that they presented to me because I was very smart and successful. So What can you tell me? Yeah.
So what was the turning point in treatment for you?
So I spent 21 days in inpatient, and they thought I was doing just such a wonderful job that they said long-term is for you. And I spent a full year in a long-term, very strict, not a halfway house. It was a long-term treatment center with other women. And it's so funny. I was actually reflecting on this. It's not, I was going to say coincidental, but it's not, because I just had my sobriety date a month ago. I was just writing about this, about how I was sitting on the steps. We lived in this old house in Statesboro, Georgia. And I was sitting on the steps of this house with my counselor, again, after months of whining and saying, this just isn't for me. Please just let me go home, because I ain't going to do this. It's not going to work. And saying that I just can't be abstinent. Like, that's not an option. This sucks. This is awful. I can't do this for the rest of my life. And my counselor, she's not sober. She's not in recovery, nor does she need to be, looked at me and said, is it possible that there's a third way that you haven't even considered? You keep talking about abstinence or using. And is it possible that there's a whole third way that you haven't even considered that's not abstinence, that's not gripping your seat, white knuckling and hoping that you can make it through the day, that there's something else? Do you really think that your dad has been white knuckling it for 4 years, knowing how bad his addiction was? And I was like, oh my God, maybe there is this other thing that I haven't fully been able to comprehend at this point. And I, at that point, said that I was willing to prove them wrong, that I would do everything that they asked me to do to the T, with as open a mind as I could possibly do it, just to prove that it wouldn't work. And 16 years later, unfortunately or fortunately, it's worked.
Yeah. It's worked in spite of you.
Yes.
And that kind of thinking, which is really just so powerful. So when we say that it worked, what worked then? So at that point, wasn't the 6-month mark, was it? Was it the 6-month mark, or was that?
I say that a little glib. It was a little earlier than that. It was like month 4 or 5, somewhere around there.
Yeah. No, the only reason I press on it is because I want families I want it to be honest. I want it to be like, look, you weren't going to treatment that day. You went to treatment that day.
Yeah.
And if it hadn't been for the fact that you didn't have the option to just go ahead and walk out, I mean, you could have voluntarily, you could have, but again, the support of the boundaries that your family had in place, that it's like, yeah, you can do whatever you want. We have to respect that, but you're going to be doing it somewhere else.
Yeah. We're not supporting it.
So and this is, sometimes I don't want to like be the Debbie Downer type of person, but like I've been doing this for a long time, interventions and helping people get into treatment. And your case, and I'd love if you push back on it. I'd love if you go like, no, I don't know.
Yeah.
Your case is like, if you would have been left to your own devices until you were like 21, like where you could finally get out on your own, it would have been really hard to get into treatment, right? So the fact that you, like, for someone who is smart, now this is what I mean just in general, for someone who is super intelligent, right, and as like addicted as you were in your teens, if you don't deal with it then, you're going to have serious problems when that person's in their 20s, and then it's like, good luck if you're trying in their 30s or 40s, if they live that long. But, the people that I've seen struggle the hardest and the most difficult interventions are the guys and the girls that are super smart. They're too smart for this. They're definitely going to be able to figure their way out of whatever, because look at all the success they've had. They've done this, they've done that, and if they have a life and then they have a career and they have all of those things, it just becomes very difficult to intervene, is the point.
I totally agree with that. to your point, with one asterisk that I don't know that I would have made it to 21. But aside from that, I totally agree with you because I already had that mentality. 100%. What are you going to tell me? I've got all the things that I'm supposed to have and then some as a teenager. I'm doing all the things. Back off. I think I deserve this. Right? Yeah,
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. So the fact that you got in when you did, and then you had to keep your butt in the seat.
Yeah.
And that's what it took. It wouldn't have happened if you would have been at home. It wouldn't have happened if, if somehow you negotiated that deal and you're like, let me smoke weed. And they were like, okay, let's try that. That it wouldn't have happened. But it's oftentimes it's like the hitting bottom, so to speak, happens in hindsight. Hitting bottom happens when you're sitting in treatment already. Yes. It's not about what happened then. It's what's happening in that moment when all of a sudden you go, oh, maybe there is another way. And not only that, but and if I'm going to live, I guess I'm going to have to actually give this a shot. And so what worked for you is, so I'm going to do this out of spite.
That's right. That's because I'm so smart. I'm going to prove him wrong.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes. Which is one of my favorites because I remember being very impacted by someone who told her story early on when I first got sober, who said, she hated it. She hated everyone. She hated coming here. She didn't want to do the steps. But she happened to walk into a room that was very big on sponsorship right away. Mm-hmm. And so despite herself, and not because she asked, she got introduced to someone that became her sponsor. And that sponsor said, this is what you're going to do. And she just kind of thought, oh, this is what you have to do because you're here. This is what they must do, right? And not every meeting works like that. Not every meeting is the same. And so anyway, this sponsor started having her follow directions. And she was literally I had no interest in doing any of it. I hated doing it. But she just followed the directions that she was told. And then she used the example of, so if you go to the supermarket and you buy a box of Duncan Hines and you follow the recipe on the back, you're going to get brownies.
That's right.
That's it. Right. That's what happens. And so it doesn't matter even if you're kicking and screaming, if those directions get followed, people recover. And so from the family perspective, the point here is, what can you do to help them be in the place, whatever that is for them, for a long enough period of time to allow them to kick and scream?
A couple of things that I think that this program did really well. We only had one 10-minute phone call a week to an approved person. So you could call your mom and dad, and that was it, right? So that there wasn't a lot of time for a bunch of me complaining to them or them cajoling me or getting swept up in all the weird thoughts that I had. You had 10 minutes, right? Mm-hmm. You could write letters as much as you wanted to, but that forces you to slow down and think about what you're sending, both in the family side and the patient side.
Yeah. And
family visits were few and far between, and they were held off until I didn't see my family for the first 4 months that I was there. Thank God. And that first one wasn't like, okay, go eat at Moe's and walk around the park. It was, you are in an intensive family counseling session. We're going to figure some stuff out real quick, right?
Yeah.
That was really helpful. And again, I was there for an entire year, and I think my family came 2 or 3 times, and then I got to go on a home visit once towards the end, right, to kind of see. At that point too, I already had a plan of what was going to happen after I left, and it was not going back home, right? Mm-hmm. So giving the patient space and recognizing, it's funny, I worked at that treatment center for a little bit after I graduated, and I remember talking to a friend who was also a counselor about this weird argument I'd gotten in with one of the patients, and she was like, yeah, but you're the crazy one. You're arguing with someone, an inpatient. What does that make you? And it's the same thing for the family. We are so sick when we get in there, and the thoughts that come to mind, that engaging with that is not fruitful. It's not helpful. It doesn't help the family at all either.
Yeah. Yeah. So what did you begin to do differently in there? Or like, when did you start to see a difference in yourself?
Gosh, that whole time is such a blur. And it's funny because a few of us got back together for a reunion a few years ago, and it was like, gosh, do you remember this? Do you remember this? And we're like, I don't remember that at all, but do you remember this? Somewhere around like pretty quickly after I had that realization that maybe there's a third way, or that I was introduced to that realization. I did not have that. I was given that, and started to work with the sponsor and intentionally prove everyone wrong. It started getting better. I started not feeling as insane and as itchy to get out and to go use again. It chilled out a little bit pretty quickly after that.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, so when you were approaching leaving, was there any, concern on your end, or what you felt like confident, or?
I was terrified in a lot of ways. So around the time that I finished high school in long-term treatment, I needed one language class and took an online class. And I got in tons of trouble with that too. This was before I had given in and started trying to do it their way. And I was on MySpace and connecting with people and got found out, and whole kerfuffle there. But I graduated high school in long term. And then towards the end of my stay, they encouraged me to enroll in college. And one of the cool things, this is something to definitely pay attention to too, with young people getting sober, is there's a lot of colleges now who have collegiate recovery communities. Mm-hmm. And this was new when I was going through. Georgia Southern is the university I went to, and it was one of the first to have this, aside from like Texas Tech. And so the plan was to enroll in college and to move into, there's this like little crummy apartment building out back behind the treatment house. And so I had like a transitional house there, and then they're like, okay, it's time for you to get an apartment, while I was in my first semester at Georgia Southern. And my God, I was terrified. I was still under house rules, and so I didn't have a cell phone. I barely knew how to get around campus. I was trying to like interact with people, and they were like, where are you from? And I'd say, Oxford, North Carolina. And they're like, what are you doing in Statesboro? And I'd be like, I live in a house with other women. And they're like, oh, you're in a sorority. And I'd say, no. And it was just a very weird, awkward time. But each day, I stayed deeply connected with the sponsor and would check in with the treatment house. And it just kept like moving further and further out of the house and deeper into real life, which, yeah, it was terrifying. And it was fine all at the same time.
Yeah. And so after you did the 12 steps, right? How did that feel as far as, because from the family perspective, just from a practical perspective, right? When you're leaving the treatment program and then you're going off and you're doing all this stuff, it's like, yep, you're still connected and you have your intrinsic motivation. You're doing what you're doing. Did you have any sorts of any kind of thinking, any close calls, any sort of, moments of, like, I don't want to do this anymore, I should go get high, or anything like that?
Nothing so heavy that it stands out today, right? I know that there were moments where I was like, well, this kind of sucks. Everyone else is going out on a Friday to go get screwed up, and I'm going to go work at the treatment center and get the girls a movie to watch, right, from the video store. Yeah. But nothing so heavy that it was like, and so therefore I'm having to white knuckle it again. Some of that was the lucky, whatever you want to call it, the opportunity to be in a community where there were a bunch of young people who were sober. A bunch of us got funneled through that treatment center. A bunch of us went to long-term or to halfway houses affiliated, and a bunch of us then went to Georgia Southern. And so there was a built-in community that was robust, right? And was big enough too that there were various little cliques. And so if you didn't like this group, it was cool. You could go to this 12-step group that was just as robust and just as great with a whole different set of people that you might like better, right? Wow. And so that made a big difference, a huge difference. It felt, we were all, weird. You had the heroin addicts and the meth addicts running around Georgia Southern, but we were doing it together, and it was fine, and it felt normal enough.
Yeah. And so I think that's instructive too, just to, I don't think that many parents are, falling for this today. Although I did literally just have a phone call today where one of the parents is in this place, but it's not a quick fix, right? That what you did was, and my partner Danny, he oftentimes, he's my co-host on the podcast oftentimes, and he's just like, a year is a blip.
Yes.
It's like, so when you're thinking like, oh my God, a year of treatment, it is a blip in time, and then look what's happened, but all of that support around it, that it's not a 28-day treatment program is really a drop in the bucket. And if you would have done a 28-day treatment program, you would have been back out and, you would have eaten that for breakfast.
Especially, and I think this is so important to emphasize now, as a former heroin addict, I could have gone back out and relapsed and overdosed very easily, but my likelihood of dying then was not as high as it is now.
Right.
And the likelihood of going to a 28-day treatment, lowering your tolerance, and then going back out with the substances that are out there today, the chance to die is so high. It's so high. 28 days is nothing. It's not even a blip. It's like blinking. It's nothing. It's barely doing anything, in my humble opinion, as someone who has only had this one experience. The other thing, too, because a year does seem insane until it isn't. The other thing I think about, I have a good friend who was a using buddy of mine back when. And when I left, it kind of screwed up the whole gang, if you will. I was supplying everyone with needles, right? So it screwed things up. And he got on Suboxone and didn't go to treatment. And that's fine. That's great. And it kept him alive. And I'm so grateful for that. But we kind of have chuckled about how I took a whole year out of society and lost a year, quote unquote. And he didn't. And instead, he got on Suboxone, got off of heroin, but kept doing a bunch of other stuff, went to school on time, and didn't know what he was doing, wasn't clear-headed, was on a ton of other drugs, had to transfer schools, almost flunked out of the first one, added a bunch of years to his college education. By the time I had finished with my master's degree, he had finished his undergrad degree, and my lost year wasn't a lost year at all.
Yeah. It was like gaining a life.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I read somewhere that you talk about one of your themes is life after survival.
Yeah. And that's not original to me. Ironically, this is from a spoken word poet, Buddy Wakefield, that I heard one day screwed up before I got sober. And he has this poem that he does. And that line is in there, that there is life after survival. And it has stuck with me. I have one of his poems tattooed on me. Like, it has stuck with me from that day. Because I was stuck in survival when I first heard it, right? And just thought, okay, I don't fully understand that, but something's resonating there. And truly, like, the life after survival, the life I have is incredible. Second to none.
Yeah.
I'm jealous of me. Like, I love what I get. My day-to-day, it's amazing. And there are obviously times, I'm 34 now, there are times when I think about, like, wonder what it's like to sit around and have a glass of wine. Weed's legal everywhere now. Wonder what it would be like just to sit back and smoke a joint now, or whatever, right? And yet I don't have any desire to actually fully gamble that and to actually figure out what that ante looks like that I'd be putting on the table. Am I risking my whole life? All of it? Not interested.
Yeah.
Not worth it.
Yeah. I mean, I asked that question before just for, family members who are listening, but I know the answer ahead of time, right? Like that struggle that people think that we're having is not there anymore because we're in recovery now. We've adopted these principles. We got through the kicking and screaming phase. Now that's going to be different for everybody. But ideally, once that happens and we adopt this new way of life and we live by these principles and we recover, then what happens is the thought to drink is just like any other thought.
Yeah.
It has no, it's like that used to stick to me like Velcro. And now it just floats on by just like any other thought. It doesn't attach to me. It doesn't pull me. It doesn't do anything anymore where it used to. It absolutely used to. It used to be the driving thought.
It was the only thought, right? It was the only thought. It was the only thing I could conceive of was, what do I do to get my next fix?
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah. So what's your relationship like with your father today?
Oh my gosh. My dad and I'm so grateful for him. And it's so funny too, because of course I hated him for the longest time in treatment, this first 6 months at least. He and I have the coolest relationship. We talk shop, we talk about, we do everything from like trading drug stories in a funny, fun way to mostly talking about sobriety and talking about the philosophy of it. And cracks me up when he's like, there's this asshole at the meeting today and I accidentally shared at him and I shouldn't have. And now I feel, we laugh about that kind of thing and have an incredibly deep connection that is untouched. Yeah.
Yeah. It is pretty cool when you can bond over the recovery stuff.
Yeah, it is. And my mom and I, she's not in recovery and we don't have the same relationship that my father and I do because of that. But I have a relationship with my mom today that I never would have thought possible either. We had, and my brother for that matter, all of us. In fact, to the extent to which I spent 10 years in Georgia after getting sober, because I'm from North Carolina, got shipped off to Georgia and stayed there for 10 years in various cities. And for the longest time had this perception that I can't go back home, that we're sick together and it would be bad and it just wouldn't work. And there was a trip that I took with my dad out to this island on the Outer Banks called Ocracoke. Beautiful place. If you ever get a chance to go, you should. You have to take a ferry to get there. It's the only way to get there. And a hurricane was coming in, and so we had to leave early because otherwise we wouldn't be able to get the ferry to get off. So we get back to my parents' house, and my brother comes over, and we're all hanging out at the house, and the power goes out, and there's the hurricane, the whole nine. We're sitting around in the dark by candlelight working on a crossword puzzle, and I had this realization of like, holy heck, we're all healthy now. Like, we've all taken the time to get to where I could move home if I wanted to. I think I do want to move home. And I did. I moved back to the small town for a few years even. And nothing bad happened. It was incredible. I had some incredible years of being able to be in the same tiny town as my parents and my brother.
Wow. And what was that like?
Incredible. Aside from having to help my parents downsize, if you ever get the opportunity to help your parents downsize, that's an experience. But genuinely incredible. A deepening of our relationships, the ability to have some of those conversations like I was talking about with my dad, completely revolutionized our relationship to be able to do that.
Yeah, what was it like to bring your recovery self to town? And like, were you involved in the community at all and doing anything, or did you have to, kind of avoid?
No, it was amusing because I remember we have this, my hometown is the home of the North Carolina Hot Sauce Festival. It's our one claim to fame. I remember walking around the Hot Sauce Festival and running into someone that I knew in high school. They were like, whoa, you're still alive. That's incredible. Congratulations.
Wow.
Because a bunch of us aren't. Most of the people that I ran with aren't. So, yeah.
And so most aren't, but you said that you just had a reunion with a bunch of people from the treatment facility. It's funny. I was talking to another good friend of mine in sobriety about this just today, because she was like, what's going on with the residence girls? We had a reunion. They're doing okay. They're alive. One, a couple years later, confessed that she had relapsed years before and hadn't told anyone. And she's back on her feet and is getting sober again. And I'm really proud of her. And the others they're trying. They're trying, but there's a lot of the women that I went to treatment with either aren't sober or aren't alive. And most of the people that I ran with before I got sober are not alive, period. And it's a rough life out there. Yeah. It's as painful a realization as you can have, we've lived it.
Yeah.
And we've lost a lot of people, right? But for family members who are listening, it sucks. It sucks. And as much as it sucks, it's like I am trying to force you to have the understanding that treatment or no treatment, as you just highlighted there, it's like death is one of the outcomes when we're talking about addiction, right?
Yep.
And so there's a lot of people that you ran with before you went to treatment who aren't alive anymore.
Oh, yeah.
But more are alive, including yourself, who went to treatment. So we're not dealing with guarantees, but what we can guarantee is that there's a far greater likelihood that death is going to be, one of those endings, premature early death, if there's no plucking going on.
That's right. Yeah. 100%.
And so that's the part where it's tough. It requires a perspective shift, not just, families, but societally. That's why I do, what I do. I have the podcast to raise awareness on that a bit. I'm a bit of a, an intervention advocate, if you will, that I, if you have someone that is in active addiction, as both my story and your story and so many of the stories that I have heard, I mean, this is the first time you and I have met, right?
That's
it's the first time
Yes.
I've ever spoken with you, and we get into the details, and it's like, oh, look, once again, if she had not gotten plucked from AP English, she wouldn't have wound up in treatment. And because she went to treatment, now she's alive and she has 16 years sober and she's done all these wonderful things and she has a successful business and she's great, right? But if there was no plucking, there's no guarantee that Leah's here today.
No, and I think the safer bet is that I would not have been. And even if I were, I certainly would not be a functional member of my family. Specifically, because I know that we talk about functional member of society in our circles, but forget that even, right? I know that it is difficult to send your loved one off and to say, I need you to go do this thing, and I'm going to put my foot down and not enable the opposite to happen. But it is a whole heck of a lot more painful to not have that person be a member of your family. And I was not a member of my family at all. And now I am, deeply.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Is there anything that I should have or could have asked that you wish that I did ask that you would like to say?
Nothing comes to mind. Again, it's a true privilege to be able to speak about this because my whole life stems from it. So I'm eternally grateful that you invited me to do this and that you're giving this information out to the rest of the world. It is needed. It's needed.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your story. And where can people connect with you?
Yeah, if you just go to leahlemberg.com, Leah Lemberg, Lem as in Mary, B as in boy, ERG.com. A lot of what I mentioned earlier, or what you mentioned earlier too, a lot of what I write about and a lot of the themes that I pull in when I work with people from a professional standpoint are based in 12-step philosophy, just because that's where my brain works. So I do write and upload essays every other week that a lot of them are going to be related to business and you're not going to care about, but a lot of them do have to do with just perspective and mindset and 12-step philosophy baked in there.
Yeah. And, I always love that too, just because of the 12-step influence that you see in so many different walks of life and how many times I've seen a family member who accompanies a sober loved one for an anniversary. And they're there and they hear what's going on and they hear people's stories and they, they're looking around. And then after the meeting, they just go, wow, I mean, they should be teaching this in college. How come we're not doing this everywhere? Right.
That's
so
right.
The fact that you're incorporating it into, what you do in business and in helping entrepreneurs, no doubt, I'm sure it's highly effective.
I'm glad to hear it. I certainly hope so.
Yeah. So thank you so much for doing this, and talk to you soon.
Sounds great. Thank you, Chris.